You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 78. Do we need to retreat? Karyne calculated how quickly he could get Daisy to star speed. It hadn't been part of any of their plans, but they'd underestimated Mavis. This was an impossible feat.
No, we need to go in,
Silmar said. You said we needed both gates breached, Daisy argued. Velden shook his head. We needed the soldiers leaving from both gates. This isn't the way we thought it would happen, but it's still taking them away from the fortress. If they're coming this way, our only option is to go in. A high-pitched howl broke through the heat of the afternoon, sending a host of birds flying from the forest canopy. Even though Felk's call had been expected, everyone stiffened, weapons drawn. In the distance, shouts from the camp grew louder. Daisy let out a relieved sigh and peeked through the trees once more. Sweet stars, she murmured. Is Felk all right? Karyne asked, unable to see past her shoulder. He's been recruiting, she said in awe. Karyne leaned past her, expecting to see a few dozen Winnicks heading for the soldiers. Instead, he took in the sight of Felk standing tall amidst a swarm of hundreds of sinewy silver bodies filling the field that separated their forest hideout from the retreating soldiers. Dozens of Winnicks loped past Felk, snarling in some sort of frenzy, like the nearness of that many men brought on a hunger for their flesh. That's impossible. Karyne's eyes burned as the sun reflected off the waves of silver skin. He'd never seen so many Winnicks in his life, let alone in one place at one time. The others around them took turns peeking through the trees, their excitement overriding their need to be quiet, especially since the Winnicks' howls drowned out any noise their own voices might have made. He said he'd found a few clans, Daisy said. And Mavis was taking their blood. Maybe she was helping their population grow over time so she could use their blood. Except they don't have star blood, so she wouldn't want them for more magic. The crease between her brow deepened. That's still probably a bad sign, isn't it? For now, we'll be grateful. Let the other possibilities be a problem for tomorrow. Karyne grinned at her. If we live until tomorrow, she muttered. Pull that dagger out if you're worried. She frowned, pulling an arrow from her quiver instead. Felk howled again. That's our signal. Silmar raised a hand, beckoning them all forward. Cyrus, Holm, Jasperus, and Iris moved past him, swords and daggers drawn. Karyne joined Velden, Lukai, and Silmar, their weapons ready, starlocks humming with anticipation. Kendallin, Aura, Marnock, and Daisy split, flanking the others with their bows drawn tight. They moved as one, but when they stepped through the trees, the two Winnicks nearest turned, their snarls turning to wild growls that drew several others. The Winnicks snapped their jaws and flashed their multiple rows of teeth, inching closer. Felk! Daisy called. Over the heads of the other Winnicks, Felk turned and howled again. The Winnicks shook their heads as if to clear them, then eyed the purple bands on everyone's arms. One leaned in to sniff Daisy, and Karyne stepped toward her, tightening his grip on the hilt of his sword. But the Winnicks leaned away before turning back to follow the crowd. As he did, Felk bounded through the Winnicks like a fish swimming upstream, then skidded to a stop before Daisy. Come, Felk said, turning to run alongside the Winnicks toward the massive outer wall of the fortress. The horde of Winnicks filled the path, forcing Karyne and the others to break formation to follow Felk. Karyne couldn't take his eyes off the roiling mass of silver backs as he and Eliana caught up to their friend. "How did you convince them all to come?" Karyne asked. Felk didn't slow his pace.
"How did you convince your men?"
"They were already looking for an excuse to go up against Mavis," Karyne said. "They would have come with or without me."
"Then our situations are not so different,"
Felk shouted over his shoulder before darting right at the wall where the other Winnicks turned left. For a moment, Karyne and the others hesitated, watching the Winnicks travel toward the open gate. By now, Mavis's soldiers had seen them, and arrows were flying. The Winnicks came anyway, crawling through the gate like ants swarming a loaf of bread. The ones who were too impatient to get through the gate clambered over the wall, and screams echoed across the distance. Large numbers of Winnicks were left behind, already dead or dying from the arrows. They had been efficient, but at a great cost. They'd functioned more like a hive fighting for the greater cause. The Winnicks jumped off the wall, teeth bared as they likely landed on zealots beyond the wall. Karyne couldn't make out any of his men from this distance, but he studied the place where they should be, praying the sun might keep them safe. "Felk's clans might actually make it harder for the soldiers to fake the need to retreat," Daisy said. Karyne let out a strangled laugh. "I can't decide if that's a good or bad thing." Felk whined, and they turned back to follow him along the outer wall, nearer to the sea and farther from the melee. Even though the ocean's waves grew louder, the forest grew denser, this portion of the wall not maintained as well as the entrance. When Felk finally stopped, Karyne had to squint to see how the cracks in the stone made up a door. Felk pulled on a few divots in its surface, sliding it open with a grinding motion that made most everyone wince. Sunlight poured into the hall, revealing an intricate smooth stone floor that would have fit in Karyne's palace if it had been given a festive rug. The walls were dark and rough, and the blackness beyond the sun's light was a gaping maw. Karyne tuned into his surroundings, hesitant to use up magic he could no longer replenish once he entered Mavis's dungeons, but not willing to step into the unknown. Faint impressions remained, the squeals of Winnicks being dragged forward, the grunts of soldiers as they fought the wild beasts. Nothing pleasant, but nothing unexpected or alarming. Felk lifted his nose to sniff the air, and a tremor ran through his body as if he sensed or smelled the same things as Karyne. He whined and stepped forward, but Silmar placed a hand on his arm.
"Felk alone frees the Winnicks so he can explain the purple bands,"
Silmar reminded them, his gaze taking in each of their group. This had been one of his stipulations when they'd agreed to both accept help from Felk and offer help in return.
"Kill any soldiers you need to, but if you can save one to question, that would be better. The more information we can gather, the sooner we can find what we came for."
Karyne smiled as Daisy exchanged her bow for the dagger, its daisy flashing in the sun's light. Kendallin, Marnock, and Aura made similar swaps, but Kendallin inched her way to the center of the line with Karyne. The two of them were Silmar's weapons to gain information by sifting souls and tuning in to memories. Felk led the way. His bare feet and hands were silent on the stone, but he let out an occasional whine that echoed off the walls, like he couldn't contain the shared sorrow of whatever they were about to encounter. The farther they went in, the more the blackness engulfed them, forcing them to rely on Felk's eyes and nose to guide them. Water dripped from somewhere deeper in, and sweat beaded on Karyne's brow, more from the dank air than any exertion. They passed a dozen halls and doors, making turns according to Felk's intuition. The passageway banked left, and soon an echo of whimpers greeted them. Felk's whining intensified, and his pace increased. A pinprick of light grew larger until they reached an oak door. Its small window revealed torchlight, and silver blood glinted in patches on the floor. Velden picked the lock on the door, and Karyne tensed as several of the others stepped into the chamber. No one cried out for battle, but Felk let out a small howl, and fists banged on iron from within the room. "Hush," Daisy whispered, and Karyne craned his neck to see beyond Holm's hulking form. A narrow hallway stretched before them, ending at the base of a staircase that rose into more blackness. A single cell door revealed several pairs of silvery hands gripping the bars. He couldn't make out more than a handful of emaciated bodies, but before he could stop himself, he tuned in to the presence of at least a dozen more behind them, most too injured to be a threat, but a few shackled and still brimming with hatred.
"We've come to rescue you,"
Felk whispered, and the banging grew louder, punctuated by more howls and whines.
"Make them stop,"
Silmar said with a growl.
"unless you want them slaughtered by the guards."
"We want at least one guard to come, right?" Karyne asked, glancing toward the stairs. "6 will come," Aura murmured from his left. He turned to squint at the strange expression on her face. "Do you know exactly what's going to happen?" She shook her head. "My power has become as unpredictable as Enla's. I could search the future for hundreds of ways to find Mavis, but I can't guarantee which ways will hold success. But every path holds 6 guards. That's convenient for no one," he muttered. Still, 6 guards was helpful information. Velden bent down to pick the lock, but cried out and stepped back as several Winnick's hands scratched at his.
"He won't hurt you,"
Felk said.
"We're taking you home."
"Felk?"
The hesitant voice came from deeper in the chamber, and Felk's eyes slid shut.
"Lilac? Yes, it's me."
A new set of hands came through the bars, and Felk gripped them in his own. A strange purring sound came from within the cell, and the rest of the hands pulled away, allowing Velden to work at the lock once more.
"They've taken our eggs."
Lilith's voice came from inside. Her words rushed with panic.
"If they've buried them, I don't know where."
The other Winnicks picked up their howls again. A click sounded from the top of the stairs, nearly drowned out by their cries.
"I told you I'd snuff your light if you kept up that racket,"
a man called. Footsteps thudded on the stone, but Karyne couldn't make out if it was a single soldier or the 6 Aura had predicted. Jasperus beckoned Karyne and Holm forward just as the man's boots came into view. His threats turned to mumbles as his knees and torso hit the light, but his eyes barely had time to widen before Jasperus's sword sliced through his gut. The man fell to his knees with a groan and reached for his wound as Jasperus pulled his sword back. When the soldier reached for the dagger at his side, Jasperus sliced the blade across the man's throat, finishing the job. But the man's cry had sent up the alarm, and more boots and shouts could be heard from above. Since the soldiers were forced to come down single file, the next one walked into the same trap as the soldier before him, but the others caught on and were quicker to fight back. Karyne and Jasperus were each left to parry with a soldier, while Holm and Lukai dispatched the final 2 guards. The soldier before Karyne was older, but still quick on his feet, matching every thrust with his own blocks and advances. The scuff of their boots echoed on the walls, joined by their grunts and the howls of the Winnicks. More than once, Karyne could have sent the soldier to his death, but he did the math, watching as Jasperus finished off the 7th soldier. They needed this one for information. The soldier feinted left, leaving his weapon exposed. When he did it a second time, Karyne was ready to disarm him, but Silmar's molten staff slammed between them, knocking both of their swords from their hands. Karyne recovered faster, only falling to one knee, while the soldier fell to his backside, scrambling back on his hands and feet. Karyne's face heated as he reached for his sword, but the soldier paled, his own sword far out of reach.
Silmar?
The man asked.
What are you doing here?
Miklaus. Silmar gave an almost respectful nod in the soldier's direction. I see they've demoted you to guard duty. Daisy and the others came closer, several holding their noses against the reek of blood and bowel spilled on the floor. Velden and Felk remained behind, likely still working at the lock. Miklaus recovered and managed a sneer.
After you left, Mavis wasn't sure she could trust me.
Karyne stood and turned to Silmar, eyebrows raised.
After you left?
Miklaus laughed, then slowly stood, his breaths still heaving from their fight.
Have you not told them of your time with Mavis?
Karyne stiffened and glanced at Daisy, whose face held an equal measure of shock.
We're well aware that he switched sides,
Iris said, stepping forward. Miklaus raised his hands in defense as Silmar shoved his still glowing staff closer to the soldier's face.
Maybe you're not all aware.
Miklaus's black eyes glittered as he focused on Daisy.
I'm guessing there's a lot of things you didn't tell the child.
Daisy frowned, glancing at Silmar.
He's not the only former zealot,
Jasperus said.
Mavis has a way of making enemies even among her followers.
Miklaus scanned the group, his gaze lingering on each face as though assessing who had once been a zealot.
So she does. Where is she?
Silmar asked.
It looks like you brought friends, so by now she could be anywhere, he shrugged. She could be at the South Tower, assessing her defenses. She could be at the Northern Keep, hiding away with her sister. Or she might have already left. Durrican comes quickly when she calls.
Daisy's eyes slid shut.
Karyne!
Silmar snapped, angling his head at Karyne while keeping Miklaus at bay with his staff.
Tune in to his memories.
Miklaus smiled and closed his eyes. Karyne complied, doubting he'd find anything of value with Miklaus's confident defiance. He stepped forward and placed a hand on the soldier's wrist, rushing his way through the man's memories. Mavis's face sprang before his mind countless times, but nothing that would give a clue as to her current whereabouts. He stepped away and shook his head, his starlock burning with his annoyance. What a waste of magic.
Check his hands,
Silmar said. Miklaus laughed again, holding out his hands for inspection.
What, you think she got rid of my brand?
A dark mark rested on his palm, not unlike the bond mark on Karyne's palm, but this one looked crudely done, the mark having bubbled up far larger and darker, like Durrican's brand had been. Silmar's face hardened, his scars looking harsher in the torchlight.
She knows you're here with me, so yes.
Miklaus leaned forward, feigning a conspiratorial whisper.
She could even be headed this way.
He barked out a deeper laugh, sending a chill through Karyne's chest. Before Karyne could even think to ask a question, Silmar's staff shifted to a shimmering sword, then swung down on Miklaus's arm, cleaving his hand from his wrist. Karyne jumped back, but still felt a spray of blood hit his face. Miklaus howled, cradling his stump to his chest as blood spurted and leaked across the floor and then his clothes. The others all took a step back, wary either of the blood or Silmar's rage. Silmar's sword shifted back to a staff, but he ignored Miklaus, bending down to poke at the soldier's severed hand. Blood dripped from the hand, quickly draining it of color, but the mark also paled, the magic of the brand fading with it. Silmar leaned on his staff and rose to his feet.
Thank you for that demonstration.
Panic clawed up Karyne's throat, and he turned to Daisy, who tucked her hand against her chest. Her eyes held fear, but then her face hardened with resolve as she caught his gaze. He shook his head and backed away, but she reached out her hand and snaked it around his wrist. "Which is better, killing me or taking my hand?" she hissed. "I don't want to do either." "You promised." Her grip tightened on his wrist, and he looked away. "I know, I did. I will." He clenched his teeth, not sure how to say that it was all a last resort he didn't expect to have to do. He didn't see how he could ever cut off her hand, let alone kill her. It was too much to ask. Miklaus's screams drowned out any more explanation Karyne might have given. "You're crazy!" Miklaus's body shook even as he stumbled back to the floor. "She always said you were." The hall filled with the shuffling of feet and whimpers only slightly held at bay. Then the shuffling shifted to a collective sniffing, and the whimpers turned to howls. "Felk?" Silmar called without looking back. "Did you explain the purple bands to our friends?" "Yes," the Winnex said from the back of the hall. "They've all agreed." "Good." Silmar pointed his staff at the stairway. "Felk can take the Winnex out to join the soldiers. It's time to resume our search." Daisy bit her lip, standing on tiptoe to get one last glimpse of Felk, but he pushed forward until he could give her a hug. "Thank you," he said. "Stay safe." She choked out a laugh. "Sending your people into battle doesn't feel like a fair trade for picking a couple of locks." "We would have come anyway," Felk said. "This is our fight as much as yours. Maybe an alliance like this can break through the next cycle." Daisy's smile wavered. They all knew how unlikely that was. "We'll remember your faithfulness even if you don't," Karyne said, surprising himself as much as them. "I can't imagine that won't count for something with the new moon. Maybe you'll have the patience to let me give you a memory or two. That's all it would take." Felk nodded in his direction, but Jasperus and Holm were already leading the way up the stairs, stepping over the broken bodies of the soldiers. The others all followed, Karyne and Kendallin taking their place in the center of the line with Daisy close behind. As Karyne reached the top of the stairs, Silmar's voice rang out from below as he addressed the Winnex. "You see our purple bands? This man doesn't have one. He was one of your captors, and he's now the first of your victims." The frenzied snarls of starved Winnex joined with Miklaus's screams in echoing off the walls.
Chapter 79. Eliana couldn't stop shaking as they made their way through the guard's room. She'd known she wasn't prepared to face Mavis, but she'd thought she was prepared for battle. Watching the others take down soldier after soldier wore on her and made her question if she could kill when the need arose. And then to have Silmar mutilate and discard Miklaus? As they spread through the guard's room, checking the closets and washroom for any lingering men, she positioned herself near Silmar. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. "I did." Silmar shifted, planting his staff between them and forcing her to stop and look up at him. "Now we know that if cutting out your mother's brand won't work, we can cut off her hand." She shivered, even though she'd suggested the same thing to Karyne. "That's not what I meant. You didn't have to feed him to the Winnex." He grunted. "They would have fed on him anyway. This way, they're more likely to follow the rule about the purple armbands." Eliana's stomach churned as she recalled the sound of teeth on flesh and the fade of whimpers. "It makes me wonder what other lines you're willing to cross." She moved to sidestep him and join the others, who checked the adjoining soldier's dormitory. His eyes burned with fury, and he grabbed her arm.
I told you I'm doing what I think is best for you and for Vendaris. I warned you that you won't always like it.
She shook his hand off. How long did you serve Mavis? How much of her ways are still ingrained in your methods? Did you partake in blood magic too? His beard shifted as his jaw clenched, and he swallowed hard and looked away.
You may not have known my history, but that doesn't mean I've kept it secret. When this is over, you'll get your answers. The important thing is that now we're both working to stop her.
Fine. She forced the word out before joining the others now at the door to the main hall. I think we should split up, Holmes said, turning from the door. Miklaus wasn't wrong. She could be in a number of places now. She could keep moving as we search, sending us in circles. Marnock frowned. Is it worth it to weaken whichever party inevitably finds her?
I doubt she's left if she knows Eliana is here,
Silmar said.
There's a small chance she's overseen the battle, but the odds are much higher that she's with Emerus or even preparing for the branding ceremony.
Eliana squirmed, tightening her hold on her dagger so the grip rubbed against her palm. The bond mark was bad enough, but having a brand like Miklaus's would feel like some sort of leech living under her skin. I could take a few of us to the South Tower, and if she's not there, we could meet you at the Northern Keep, Holmes said. I'll go with you, Aura said, placing a hand on his back. Thank you. Holmes tugged at his too tight vest. Eliana got the impression he would have picked anyone else before Aura. It's not a bad idea to have more archers up on the parapets, Karyne said. Maybe Kendallin should join them. You already have disguises. If you relieve one of Mavis's soldiers at an arrow slit, you can help the people still attacking the castle. He shifted from one foot to the other. At least, whichever ones haven't started the intentional withdrawal. Eliana didn't need magic to sense the weight of his thoughts, the burden of the men he'd left behind. She hated the idea of splitting up, but his fear became her own. She patted the vial in her chest, the insanity of attempting to brand a dragon no longer seeming so ridiculous.
Holm, Marnock, Kendallin, and Aura can head for the Southern Tower,
Silmar conceded.
Send word immediately if she's there. Aid those on the ground if you can, but if it's too late, for any reason, come help us instead.
Garen's jaw tightened, but he nodded along with everyone else. When Holm opened the door, they split ways, Holm taking his 3 archers and Silmar leading the others toward the Northern Keep. The halls were strangely deserted, but Eliana supposed the soldiers had all been called to arms. They went past dozens of doors, some open to reveal disheveled bedchambers or a paper-strewn war room or chancery, but most remained closed. Silmar had spent hours studying the maps of Mavis's fortress, but he ran through them like someone who had known the halls well. What had he done for Mavis before defecting? And why hadn't he told Eliana? She couldn't help feeling misled, like the truth had been kept from her in order to manipulate her. He'd always been gruff, but she'd at least trusted him to look out for her. Now she didn't know what to think. Silmar and Velden cut down the few men they came across, and Iris and Cyrus did the same to those who came up from behind. Most had been sent out to fight, just as they'd hoped, but it still became glaringly clear that Eliana was being coddled in the center of the group. As much as she hated it, she wasn't about to volunteer to step forward and take out the next person who rounded the corner. Not after stepping across bodies and slipping on the blood of fallen men. Men who looked exactly like Karyne, Cyrus, or Lukai in the uniforms they'd stolen. Some with sun-bleached hair like Karyne's, their mouths frozen in shock instead of a smirk. Some with freckles like Cyrus, though none as pale or red-haired. One had Lukai's golden curls and upturned nose. The devastating sight of his broken body on the floor, making her regret holding her bondmate's actions from the night before against him. Eventually, the halls turned to stairs leading to the tower in the north, the keep that might hold Eliana's mother and aunt. The stone here was darker and rougher, more like the dungeons where they'd found the Winnocks. She supposed they were in the older areas of the fortress, but she couldn't help imagining that those stones had also soaked in more blood, had held more of the dark spirits over the years. The stairs opened up to a final hall filled with heavy oak doors. By now, the sun was lower in the sky, its light spilling through windows, highlighting the dust in the air as if to give false hope that the area was abandoned. Silmar slowed down, sending Velden, Jasperus, and Lukai out through the rooms ahead. As each was determined to be clear, they inched forward. Sweat ran down Eliana's brow. They were taking too long. If Mavis felt threatened, she could be performing the branding ceremony right now. She studied the scars on her palms, eyeing the dark mark of her bond, wondering if Mavis would brand over it or use the other palm. Or was that something determined by the stars or sun? She squeezed her hands into fists, letting her fingernails dig into both scars and bond. When she glanced up, Karyne was studying her, his face unreadable. A shout came from the room ahead. It sounded like Jasperus. Then the sound of steel on steel. Silmar, Cyrus, and Karyne rushed forward, but Iris held Eliana back in the hall. "They need our help," Eliana said. "You can help them far more by surviving, love," Iris said. "They might need you to heal them." If they survived. Eliana wanted to add the words, but they stuck in her throat as the sounds of grunts and reverberating metal grew louder. Lukai and Velden came from 2 other rooms, following the sounds of the skirmish, confirming Eliana's suspicion that it was Jasperus who'd first cried out. She closed her eyes, imagining blades slicing through each of her comrades, wounds too deep to be healed by her limited magic. A coldness swept over her, and she shivered, trying to redirect her thoughts. But with the goosebumps came an overwhelming sense of familiarity. She opened her eyes and stood straighter, leaning into the sensation with fresh understanding. "The dark spirits," she whispered. Iris stiffened. "What?" "Someone's doing blood magic." Before Iris could stop her, Eliana rushed toward the fight. I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. Thanks so much for listening.